Someone could be looking after the managing the computer. Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagatgurum. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Today we'll be discussing chapter 13 of Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita, entitled The Lord of the Sacrifice, pages 124 to 133. We attempted to live stream this class the Sunday before last Sunday, and it wasn't recorded properly. And so I'm redoing the class today with a small group of students. So my apologies for that. Okay, so this chapter is the last chapter in a number of chapters discussing the extremely important concept of sacrifice in the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, sacrifice comes up in verses 9 through 16 of chapter 3, as we remember, and in verses 24 to 35 of chapter 4. So it's a very prominent theme in chapters 3 and 4. And a heads up for the next class. Our next class is on Sunday, September 15th at 9:30 a.m. PST. The assignment is to read verses 20 to 43 of chapter 3 and verses 5 to 14 of chapter 4. And one thing to keep in mind is that this chapter that we're going, and chapter 14 of Essays on the Gita, the next chapter, and this is going to be called The Principle of Divine Works, pages 134 to 144, and to answer the study questions, okay, by Saturday, 7 p.m. PST. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that Sri Aurobindo, there are a few verses in chapter 3, 3.27, and the next few verses, which concern free will and determinism. Okay? Sri Aurobindo, in this chapter 14 that we're going to discuss on Sunday, skips those verses. Not because he doesn't think they're important, but because he devotes an entire chapter to them later in the Essays on the Gita. We'll get to that in a subsequent class. So just that's why you might be confused about why those verses are being skipped. They're being skipped because he wants to treat free will and determinism as a separate theme. Okay. Now, this chapter, chapter 13, The Lord of the Sacrifice, is a pretty challenging chapter, just in terms of writing style, the concepts. It's like heavy philosophy. And I wanted to begin with a question. The question is the following. Look up at the board here. This is from page 125 of Essays on the Gita. He makes a very succinct statement. He says, all truth of works must depend upon the truth of being. All truth of works must depend upon the truth of being. What do you think he means by this? In the context of this chapter.
That being is a prerequisite to work.
What do you mean by being here? Or what do you think he means by being?
Maybe like existence.
Okay. So you have to exist in order to work, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay, but there's...
You have to be in order to do.
Okay, yeah, that's true. I think that that's a kind of triviality, though, in a way, right? Because there's got to be some deeper point that he's making here.
The underlying foundation is the same for the being and the works, is the substratum of the being.
What is a substratum?
It's the Purushottama.
Yes,
right?
that's true. In the case of, his interpretation of the Gita. How would this statement also apply, let's say, to classical Advaita Vedanta, by contrast?
I don't think it would apply, right? Because the works...
Yeah, why? Well, explain why.
Because there's only truth. The works and being is like Maya, right? Isn't it? It doesn't exist.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I think you're on the right track. The idea here is how we understand the nature of ultimate reality determines the status of work. So if we take ultimate reality to be only nirguna Brahman, as classical Advaita Vedanta does, right? Static, inactive, it's akarta, it's impersonal, right? Pure consciousness. Then we lose a rationale for working continuously. Of course, there's still a place for karma yoga in Advaita Vedanta. What is that place? It's a preparatory discipline. So long as we have impure minds, through karma yoga, we purify our minds. But once we have a sufficiently pure mind, what happens? We stop practicing karma and we practice jnana yoga instead, right? So I think this statement applies across the board. Not only, it applies to multiple paradigms, philosophical paradigms. Because classical Advaita Vedanta takes the ultimate reality to be Nirguna Brahman, therefore it doesn't give much pride of place to karma yoga. It puts it on a lower footing. Whereas, if we take the truth of being to be the Purushottama, as you mentioned earlier, and what is the Purushottama?
It is the Kshara and Akshara Purusha. It is.
Yeah, Kshara and Akshara. Right. What is Kshara Purusha?
The changing
world, basically.
Yeah,
Nature.
right.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And
the unchanging reality.
Akshara is the unchanging reality. You can say it's a kind of
Prakriti and Purusha.
Purusha.
It's a combination of those two.
Yeah. So it's
Impersonal.
impersonal and personal, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So this brings us, it's a nice segue into our study question number 2. Here's study question number 2. On page 131 of Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo writes, the impersonal Brahman is not the very last word, not the utterly highest secret of our being. For impersonal and personal, finite and infinite, turn out to be only two opposite yet concomitant aspects of a divine being, unlimited by these distinctions, who is both these things at once. And the question is, can you think of any teachings of Sri Ramakrishna that are similar or identical to what Sri Aurobindo is saying here? Anyone want to take a stab before I mention some online participants? Yeah. Very good. Speaking Bengali, look at this. Very impressive. A Telugu lady is. Okay. So, Jini Nirgun Tini Shogun.
Yes.
That divine reality, which is Nirguna, is also Saguna. And he also says, Jini Nirakar Tini Shakar. And in fact, Praful, he's an online participant. He or she? I think it's a he. I always get confused with it. Prafullo. Okay. Praful says, Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Jini Nirgun Tini Shogun. Also, Jini Nirakar Tini Shakar. And Jari Nitto Tari Lila. That divine reality to which the Nitya belongs, the eternal, the Lila also belongs to the same divine reality. Okay. And Praful says he also taught the concept of Brahma Shakti Abhed, the inseparability or non-difference of Brahman and Shakti. And Praful continues, more generally, Sri Ramakrishna used to say there is no limit to God, Bhagavan kono iti nahi, which can be interpreted to mean that there is no limitation on what constitutes God. That is, everything that can or cannot be conceived are all different aspects of God. Yes, Shubha, another online participant, he mentions a few things. Number 1, Brahma Shakti Abhed. Fire, like fire and its power to burn. 2, the chameleon story. One gains aspect of divine per one's own inclination, yet all such aspects are part of the one. He also mentions the elephant and the blind man story. So there are many things. And of course, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana. Okay. Good. So that's crucial. And I suggest that we... Okay, so let me first give a little bit of a summary of the chapter. Okay, structurally, the structure of the chapter. The traditional spiritual view at the time that the Gita was composed is that at some point in spiritual life, karma needs to be renounced. Karma sannyasa means you stop engaging in actions, apart from the begging for food and whatever it takes for jnana yoga and stuff like that. Okay, Bhagavad Gita is defending the practice of karma yoga at the beginning of spiritual life, in the middle of spiritual life, and even at the end of spiritual life. What is the end of spiritual life? Even after God realization, even after realization of the self, you continue to engage in karma yoga, not as a spiritual aspirant, but as a realized soul. Okay? And this very different understanding of karma yoga is based on a redefinition of sannyasa, the concept of sannyasa. And this brings us to the first study question, and let me read you the first study question. On page 129 of Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo writes, the real renunciation, for renunciation sannyasa there must be, is not the fleeing from works, but the slaying of ego and desire. And the question is, can you think of a time in your life when you realize the truth of this insight? How might this insight help you in your day-to-day life? Please give specific examples. So, this is one little mild scolding for people who are in person. The online participants are, especially recently in the past few classes, have been much better about submitting their study question responses than you guys, the people attending in person. And I'd strongly encourage you, people who are have the privilege of attending this class in person, to do the submit the response to the study questions. It makes the class, you'll get more out of the class. You'll get as much out of the class as you put into it. And it just helps in terms of just the productivity of the class, the fruitfulness of the class. Okay, so, sorry, gentle scolding over. So now, I want to read to you some very thoughtful responses I got from the online participants. Padma says, I think she lives in San Diego. She says, she talks about raising children in this context, about sannyasa. She says, I'm finding this insight especially helpful as a parent. Needless to say, parenting is a lot of work, and it is hard to do it with the spirit of renunciation. Recently, our daughter was recognized for some of her work by the local community. At the end of the ceremony, when people came up to me, most of them said, "You must be a proud mom." And I could genuinely say to them, I am actually a very grateful mom. I'm working on changing my attitude from one of pride to one of gratitude, and I try to keep in mind the poet Khalil Gibran's words. It's a very beautiful poem. 4 lines. Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. Capital L, life. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. These verses and the insights from the Gita, when I remember them, help me treat parenting as a custodian and to treat the highs and lows with gratitude and humility. Sultan, another online participant, talks about applying sannyasa to his relationships. He says, I've realized the truth of this insight when I analyze my relationships with others. Before reading the Gita, when there was tension, oftentimes my go-to tactic was abandonment. Looking back on those times, I now realize that abandonment was the easy way out. And it did not allow me to grow and learn from the circumstance that caused the tension in the first place. Non-abandonment and the slaying of ego and desire have been my foundations for trying to be more selfless. In day-to-day life, this insight helps me to detach myself from the work or situation and stay calm under pressure while still offering my best efforts. And Praful, that same Praful that I was talking about with regard to the previous study question, makes a very interesting comparison between the Bhagavad Gita's concept of sacrifice and Stoic philosophy. So if some of you are familiar with Stoicism, if you're not, it's even more interesting. Okay, Praful says, this insight can help us in day-to-day life in 2 ways. First, in the negative manner, informing us of what not to do, which is to not fantasize about running away into the Himalayas, as that will only make our life more miserable. Okay. Secondly, this insight helps us in a positive manner, informing us of what we should do, which is inward renunciation. This initially manifests as renunciation of objects, meaning the fruits of our actions, followed by the more subtle renunciation of the sense of doership of actions. This is the correct method of renunciation that actually removes misery and provides contentment. He says, renunciation of doership of actions is very subtle, but one can at least start working towards the inner renunciation of objects by using the following practice, drawing inspiration from section 3 of the book Enchiridion by Epictetus, one of these great Stoic philosophers. Here's the practice. Take any object that you use regularly, or any object to which you are attached. Remind yourself of its relation to you and the object's true nature. You will realize that for most such objects, their importance to you is a construct of your imagination. And for all such objects, their nature is impermanence. anityam asukham. That's from chapter 9 of the Gita. He says, start with the most trivial things. If you have a lucky shirt, remind yourself that it is just a shirt like any other. Its luckiness is only in your imagination, and that it is bound to tear up sooner or later. If you have a favorite chair, realize that it is a piece of wood that will rot sooner or later. Gradually, over the years, we can move on to things with which we have a stronger attachment. Our wealth, our profession, our educational qualifications, our learning, even our physical body, which we realize is undeniably subject to disease, old age, and death. Doing this practice on a regular basis, we can try to reduce our sense of ownership and attachment towards material objects and slowly get closer to the state of perfect inner renunciation. Okay, so these are just some examples of how people find the relevance of this idea of an inner sannyasa, inner renunciation of ego and desire, and applying that to their daily spiritual life. I'll have to skip some of the other ones because we have quite a bit more to do. So now, let's go back to chapter 13 of Vaishnavism Gita. Okay. So now, this first sentence again, remember, all truth of works must depend upon the truth of being. Now we know that on Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Gita, this truth of being is the Purushottama, which is impersonal, personal, static in one aspect, and dynamic in another aspect, in a Shakti aspect, Chit Shakti, or the personal God. And that Shakti aspect of the Purushottama manifests as everything in this world. You were mentioning Kshara Purusha, that's this dynamic world. That has two aspects, apara prakriti and para prakriti. Anyone know? What is apara prakriti and what is para prakriti? First of all, what is the translation of apara prakriti?
That's not seen?
No, apara. Para means supreme.
Okay.
So apara prakriti means the lower nature or inferior prakriti.
Okay.
And para prakriti means the supreme nature, capital N nature. Now, apara prakriti refers to this world of insentient entities. Okay? Table, laptop, and so on. Para prakriti, the supreme prakriti, refers to each individual conscious being, each jiva. In chapter 7 of the Gita, Bhagavan Krishna actually says that, defines the jiva as para prakriti. Okay? And in chapter 15 of the Gita, Mamevamsho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatanaha. Each jiva is a portion of the Purushottama, of Krishna, Purushottama. Okay? And each jiva is the para prakriti. So the Purushottama manifests as all the insentient entities in this world, which is namely apara prakriti, and manifests as all individual souls, which is para prakriti. Okay? So, when we act in this world, when we engage in karma yoga or any action whatsoever, the jiva is acting. The jiva itself is an amsha, a portion of the Purushottama. So all our action is a sacrifice of nature for the sake of the Purushottama in the grand cosmic scheme of things. So that provides the ultimate rationale for sacrifice and for action. So that when we engage in karma yoga, we're engaging in an act of sacrifice for the sake of the Purushottama. That's the idea. Because this is something that one of Sri Aurobindo's favorite phrases to quote. The last verse of chapter 5 of Bhagavad Gita, Bhoktaram yagyatapasam sarva loka maheshwaram suridam sarvabhutanam nyatva mam shantim richati. Krishna says, know me to be Bhoktaram yagyatapasam. Know me to be the enjoyer of yajna and tapas. Yajna means all sacrifices and all austerities. So now, the title of this chapter, chapter 13, is The Lord of the Sacrifice. Who is the Lord of the Sacrifice? It should be obvious by now. Exactly, the Purushottama. Exactly. Right? So Sri Aurobindo is saying, it's only if you accept ultimate reality as the Purushottama that you can provide a rationale for engaging in works as sacrifice throughout one's life, regardless of whether you're a spiritual aspirant or whether you're a realized soul. You should continue. And it also reminds me of the second mantra of the Ishopanishad. Does anyone know? Kurvan neveha karma ani jiji vishet shataggasama aha. One should strive to live 100 years engaging in karma. Kurvan neveha karmani. You should never stop. Shankara has a big problem with this. because of course in his philosophy you have to stop once you're eligible for Jnana Yoga. So what he says is this second mantra is meant for inferior spiritual aspirants and not for everybody. But Sri Aurobindo will say this second mantra of Isha is perfectly consistent with the whole spirit of the Bhagavad Gita. You can and should continue to engage in karma yoga throughout your life. Okay? Because all works are a sacrifice for the Purushottama. Okay, so now, what he does in this chapter is he sketches 5 stages in life as we make spiritual progress in life. I've written these on the board. The first stage in life is plain old, ignorant, ego-based existence. Vast majority of people fall in this category. These are people who ignore the law of sacrifice. So I'm thinking especially of verses 3.12 and 3.16 of Bhagavad Gita. We should remember. Aghayurindriya ramo or mogam patsajivati. People who ignore the law of sacrifice and just try to live a hedonistic lifestyle, trying to maximize their own happiness selfishly. They live in vain. Because they won't be happy, ironically, even though you think that that's the best way to be happy, is let me be as selfish as possible, maximize instant gratification. In fact, that's a recipe for unhappiness. This is something that positive psychologists are beginning to discover now as well. Okay. Now, second, at some point, living this life of hedonism, people inevitably find this isn't working, let me try something different. Then they arrive at stage 2. This is a stage of Vedic ritualism. This is described in verses 10 through 16 of Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3. Okay? Here, you accept the law of sacrifice, and you live your life based on the law of sacrifice, which means what? You follow the instructions taught by the Vedas. Sacrifice X, Y, and Z using this fire as per these instructions. Then what do you get as a result? You get happiness here and hereafter. Well, after you leave the physical body, your soul will go to a temporary heaven, enjoy there for some time. Unfortunately, it's temporary, so you can't stay there forever. You have to come back to this earth, repeat the process again, sacrifice, and that. But anyway, at least it's better. It's a step up from stage 1, but still, it's not there. There's a long way to go. Stage 3. Sri Aurobindo says, now, here's where spiritual life really begins. Vedanta proper, right? He says, through the combined practice of karma yoga and jnana yoga, and we're going to talk in a second about what karma yoga and jnana yoga are, we should realize the impersonal non-dual self, okay, capital S self, which is the basis of all existence. Himaja, you asked this question in an earlier class. You had said, yeah. So you had said, because I think you had in mind classical Advaita Vedanta, right? The self. And classical Advaitins would not use language like the self is the basis of all existence. Beings don't come from the self. But Sri Aurobindo tends to use that kind of language, and you had asked about that. And what I'd said at the time, and which I'm going to reiterate now, because I think it's really important, and he mentions it again and again in this chapter too, chapter 13, is that what Sri Aurobindo means by Akshara Brahman, this non-dual self, impersonal self, is not identical to the self of classical Advaita Vedanta. They're similar, they're deeply similar. But the difference is, according to classical Advaita Vedanta, this whole Jagat is mithya. Even jivas are mithya. So all individual souls and everything in this world is mithya. It's not, it's an illusion. So the self is not in reality the basis of anything. The moment you say the self is the basis of something, you've got duality. From the standpoint of classical Advaita, right? There's the basis and then there are things that are on top of that base, right? So Sri Aurobindo says, but the Gita teaches a different kind of Advaita philosophy. He calls it the real Advaita. Later in Hesed and Gita we'll find that. What is a real Advaita? What does Advaita mean? There's one reality. It's the one divine reality. What is that reality? Exactly, the Purushottama. In that sense, Advaita. But the world is not an illusion. The world itself, as apara prakriti and para prakriti, is also a real manifestation of the same divine Purushottama. You see? Okay. As a result, Sri Aurobindo will say, this Akshara Purusha, so the Purushottama in one aspect is the Akshara Purusha. That Akshara Purusha is the basis of this entire existence, which is itself real. And because there's nothing but the Purushottama. That's the idea. Okay? Okay, so now in chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, this is emphasized. Do you remember when we talked about chapter 2 months ago? There's almost not a single mention of Bhakti Yoga. There's only one very brief, fleeting reference to Bhakti in the entirety of chapter 2. What is that phrase? Anyone? Matparaha. Very good. Excellent. Exactly. I can't remember the verse now, but anyway, Matparaha. Yes, which means with your mind intent on me, the Purushottama, Krishna.
247.
Is it 2.47? Okay, check it and then don't just say it randomly. Check first and then, okay. So, yes, a little hint of bhakti, matparaha. But overall, what you get is Krishna saying again and again, Arjuna, you are the self, you are the self, you are the capital S self. Realize that, you're not the body-mind complex. And he does also mention karma yoga to some extent. Karmanyevadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. You have the right to action, but not to the fruits of the actions, right? Okay, but chapter 3 of the Gita, Karma Yoga becomes a more prominent theme. And what we find is that Karma Yoga itself has a bhakti element, an important bhakti element as well. So I think it's 3.30, where Krishna says, Mai sarvani karmani sanyasyadhyatma chetasa nirashi nirmamo bhutva yudhyasva vigatajvaraha. Krishna says, so this is also Karma Yoga, except that it's a kind of bhakti-inflected Karma Yoga. Whatever actions you do, make them an offering to me. Mai sarvani karmani sanyasya. Adhyatma chetasa. And keep your mind intent on, focused on the inner Atman. This is a kind of Jnana Yoga. So there's a combination of Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. Nirashi nirmamo bhutva yudhyasva vigatajvaraha. Without any expectations. I want this, I want that, I must succeed, I must get this job, I must get this promotion, I must get this raise or whatever. Nirashid nirmamo. And free from egoism. I'm so great because I'm doing this or that. Yudhyasva vigatajvaraha. 2.61 is matparaha. Sanyaga. Yukta asita matparaha. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So yeah, 2.61 matparaha. Okay, anyway. Okay, so yudhyasva vigatajvaraha. You should fight. Vigatajvaraha. Devoid of the fever of egoism and selfishness. Because worldly life is like, worldliness is a kind of fever. In a metaphorical sense, obviously. So when we're free from fever, we're healthy. We're only healthy when we realize that we are sparks of the divine fire. Okay, children of the Purushottama. Okay, so that's stage 3. Now, so the reason why Sri Aurobindo doesn't emphasize bhakti in stage 3 is because the Gita doesn't seem to emphasize bhakti in chapter 2. Right? Sri Aurobindo will point out that bhakti becomes the keynote of the entire scripture very soon. But he's also trying to understand the logical development of ideas in the Bhagavad Gita. And the Gita does not start with bhakti. It gets to it, but a little bit later, starting in chapter 3 mainly and forward. So why? Sri Aurobindo is saying the reason is because the first priority is to realize the impersonal, non-dual self. This is what Sri Ramakrishna would call jnana. Then you can get to Vijnana later, right? Okay, so now, and so a number of you online participants had this question actually, like why does Sri Aurobindo not emphasize bhakti from the beginning? I think the simple answer is that because the Gita doesn't emphasize bhakti from the beginning. But there's a complication, there's a complexity here, which is that Karma Yoga itself has a bhakti element. Of course, it doesn't become evident until chapter 3, the verse that I mentioned, 3.30. But you can read it back into the Karma Yoga of chapter 2. And if you do that, then the practice of Karma Yoga, even in stage 3, can have a bhakti element in it. If you want. It doesn't have to have it, but you can have it.
I
Yeah.
was kind of thinking about this, that isn't the number 2, the sacrifice to the devas, doesn't Krishna refer to that kind of as a lower caliber of spiritual aspirant that could be like considered a type of a bhakti, a bhakta, that it's like someone who is devoted to God in a certain aspect for worldly aims, which is a type of devotion.
Okay, I think you might have in mind a different verse, actually, not the ones mentioned here, 3.10 to 16, but actually, Chatuvida bhajante mam. Jana suktano jana. Arto jigyasurathati jnani cha bharatarshava. Krishna says 4 types of people worship me. One of them is artharti, people who come to me with worldly desires.
What chapter is this? 4?
7, I think.
Oh, 7.
4 or 7. Yeah, I have to look that up. Yeah. So 4 kinds of people. One of those kinds is this. But that's already presupposing the real God, Purushottama. Whereas the whole point of stage 2 is that these are these little minor deities. This Agni and Indra and these things, right? These devatas. The aspirants at this stage don't even have the concept of the supreme God yet. You see what I mean? That's the difference. Whereas the people who go to the supreme God to fulfill their worldly desires, I would say that's a low-grade spiritual aspirant. Yeah. And stage 2 people are not hopeless either. That's okay. It's good because they believe in the law of sacrifice. Right? And something beyond themselves. Yeah. So does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. So now we arrive at stage 4. After you've realized the impersonal non-dual self, of course, that's the goal of classical Advaita Vedanta. They think that that's it. So you're done. You're liberated. Sri Ramakrishna says that's the first spiritual necessity. This is page 129. Okay? Bottom of page 128 through 129. So let me read. He says, "It is for this reason that the Gita opens its gospel of works by insisting on the Brahmic consciousness, the impersonal life, that great object of the discipline of the ancient sages. For the impersonal, the infinite, the one in which all the impermanent, mutable, multiple activity of the world finds above itself its base of permanence, security, and peace, is the immobile self, the Akshara, the Brahman." This is the Akshara Purusha, right? If we see this, we shall see that to raise one's consciousness and the poise of one's being out of limited personality into this infinite and impersonal Brahman is the first spiritual necessity. To see all beings in this one self is the knowledge which raises the soul out of egoistic ignorance and its works and results. To live in it is to acquire peace and firm spiritual foundation. And then he goes on to explain how we arrive at this realization of the impersonal self through the combined practice of Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga. Okay? Now, however, then he says, let's look at page 130. The liberation given by this perfect impersonality is real, is complete, is indispensable. But is it the last word, the end of the whole matter? All life, all world existence, we have said, is a sacrifice offered by nature to the Purusha, the one and secret soul and nature, in whom all her workings take place. But its real sense is obscured in us by ego, by desire, by our limited, active, multiple personality. We have risen out of ego and desire and limited personality, and by impersonality, its great corrective, we have found the impersonal Godhead. We have identified our being with the one self and soul in whom all exist. Okay, let's read a little bit more. The sacrifice of works continues, conducted not by ourselves any longer, but by nature. Nature operating through the finite part of our being, mind, senses, body, but in our infinite being. But to whom then is this sacrifice offered? And with what object? For the impersonal has no activity and no desires, no object to be gained, no dependence for anything on all this world of creatures. It exists for itself, in its own self-delight, in its own immutable eternal being. We may have to do works without desire as a means in order to reach this impersonal self-existence and self-delight. But that movement once executed, the object of works is finished. The sacrifice is no longer needed. Okay, so we already talked about this in summary, which is that according to classical Advaita Vedanta, Karma Yoga can at best be a preparatory discipline. Okay? Now, Sri Aurobindo says, but the whole purpose of the Gita is to teach Karma Yoga not only for inferior spiritual aspirants, but for everybody, including realized souls. How do we know realized souls? Because in a previous class I mentioned 18.66, I believe, or 56. Sarva karmani api sada kurvano mad vapashayaha mat prasadad vapnoti shashvatam padam avyam. Even after you've attained the highest state of Vijnana, you should continue to do action in the world to serve humanity. That's the idea. Okay? So now, what's the rationale in the Gita for this? It's on page 131. Okay. I'll read from the second sentence of this paragraph. But the Gita insists that the nature of the action does matter and that there is a positive sanction for continuance in works. Not only that one quite negative and mechanical reason, the objectless compulsion of nature. Suman, can you increase the temperature? It's a little chilly. Thank you. Okay. There is still, after the ego has been conquered, a divine lord and enjoyer of the sacrifice. Bhoktaram yagatapasam. Remember the verse I mentioned. And there is still an object in the sacrifice. The impersonal Brahman is not the very last word, not the utterly highest secret of our being. And I already read this. For impersonal and personal, finite and infinite turn out to be only two opposite yet concomitant aspects of a divine being, unlimited by these distinctions, who is both these things at once. God is an ever unmanifest infinite, ever self-impelled to manifest himself in the finite. He is the great impersonal person of whom all personalities are partial appearances. He is the divine who reveals himself in the human being, the Lord seated in the heart of man. And then let's go to the next page, 132. A couple lines down. He says, we have to arrive at him, meaning the Purushottama, not through our lower personality, but through the high, infinite, and impersonal part of our being, and that we find by becoming the self one and all in whose existence the whole world is comprised. This infinite containing, not excluding all finite appearances, this impersonal admitting, not rejecting all individualities and personalities, this immobile, sustaining, pervading, containing, not standing apart from all the movement of nature, is the clear mirror in which the divine will reveal his being. Okay, so here, notice the sentence. This is really important. Going back to your question again, Himaja, about this. This impersonal self, it doesn't exclude finite appearances. It contains them. It doesn't reject individualities and personalities. It sustains, pervades, contains all the movement of nature. It's the basis of all existence, right? Okay, so then he says, therefore it is to the impersonal that we have first to attain. Through the cosmic deities, through the aspects of the finite alone, the perfect knowledge of God cannot be totally obtained. But neither is the silent immobility of the impersonal self, conceived as shut into itself and divorced from all that it sustains, contains, and pervades, the whole, all-revealing, all-satisfying truth of the divine. You can get liberation just by realizing the impersonal self. But Sri Aurobindo says liberation is not, even that by itself is not the highest goal. What's higher than that? He says, to see that, we have to look through its silence to the Purushottama, and he in his divine greatness possesses both the Akshara and the Kshara. He is seated in the immobility, but he manifests himself in the movement and in all the action of cosmic nature. To him, even after liberation, the sacrifice of works in nature continues to be offered. Even after liberation, even after realization, you continue to work. What's the rationale? Because you're spontaneously worshipping the Purushottama by engaging in these actions as sacrifice, right? And then, last paragraph of this chapter, he says, the real goal of the yoga is then a living and self-completing union with the divine Purushottama, and is not merely a self-extinguishing emergence in the impersonal being. Let's pause here for a second. Sometimes in the Gita, you find this phrase, Brahma Bhuta. What does Brahma Bhuta mean? Becoming Brahman. Brahma Bhuta. So for instance, 18.54. Brahma Bhuta prasannatma nashochati nakangshati. Samas sarveshu bhuteshu mad bhaktim lavate param. You become Brahman, like Sri Ramakrishna would use the example of the salt doll going to measure the depth of the ocean, but the moment it sets foot, what happens? It melts into the ocean. In that sense, Brahma Bhuta. you become one with Brahman in the sense that the individual self gets merged in non-dual Brahman, the Akshara Brahman. Right? Becoming sugar, in Sri Ramakrishna's analogy. But, Sri Ramakrishna would say, there are two fundamentally different paradigms of liberation. One is this becoming sugar. The other is tasting sugar, eating sugar, exactly. So there's still, you maintain some distance from God, some separation. Why? In order to enjoy the bliss of that sugar of God. And what Sri Aurobindo is saying is that the real goal of this yoga taught in the Bhagavad Gita is not becoming sugar, but actually eating sugar in the sense of enjoying the bliss of the Purushottama by seeing Purushottama manifest in everyone and serving beings in a spirit of worship. So it's exactly what Sri Ramakrishna would say, Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. Serve others in the spirit of worship by trying to see the divine in all beings. Okay? Okay. And so keep this in mind. Now, let's keep reading. Sri Aurobindo says, to raise our whole existence to the divine being, to dwell in him, Mayeva Nivasishyasi, 12.8. That's 12.8. He's quoting from 12.8. Mayeva Nivasishyasi. That means what? To dwell in me. And what Sri Aurobindo is pointing out is dwelling in the Purushottama, dwelling in God, is not the same as dissolution of the individuality and non-dual Brahman. Dwelling in me is a kind of union with the personal God, where you're eating sugar. Okay? To be at one with him, unify our consciousness with his, to make our fragmentary nature a reflection of his perfect nature, to be inspired in our thought and sense wholly by the divine knowledge, to be moved in will and action utterly and faultlessly by the divine will, to lose desire in his love and delight, is man's perfection. It is that which the Gita describes as the highest secret. It is the true goal and the last sense of human living and the highest step in our progressive sacrifice of works, for he remains to the end the master of works and the soul of sacrifice. Okay. Now, I want to address a few questions that some of the online participants had, and then I'll also take questions from the few people who are sitting here with us today. Okay, so some questions. Kamlesh has a question in the form of a mathematical formula. Purushottama equals Akshara plus Kshara, or Purushottama equals Akshara plus Kshara plus much more. What do you think?
I think much more, because what is how are they interacting
Right.
and all that?
Right. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think also I'm inclined to say that Purushottama, according to the Gita, is Akshara and Kshara, but also much more besides. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, God is Nirakar, Shakar, Abakautoki, much more besides. God is both Nirakara and Sakara, and much more besides. And he would say, you can never place a limit to God. If we just say Purushottama equals Akshara and Kshara, it's in a sense limiting God to just those two aspects, right? But God is infinite. So, but Kamalesh has a couple more questions, so let me read another. Kamalesh asks, if there exists a real nature apart from impersonal pure consciousness, then this pure consciousness cannot be an infinite existence, since there exists something apart from it. But is this pure consciousness an infinite consciousness, or is it a subset of the consciousness of Purushottama? Okay, so I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but as far as I understand it, I think what you're asking is, how does this impersonal consciousness relate to the Purushottama? This Purushottama, remember, has Akshara Brahman as one of its aspects. And that Akshara Brahman is this impersonal pure consciousness, right? But he's asking, how can that impersonal consciousness be an infinite existence if there's something separate from it, namely nature? That's the question. But remember, Sri Aurobindo says the Gita teaches Advaita, and that the only reality is the Purushottama. So that's still non-duality. What is nature? Nature itself is a manifestation of that same Purushottama. So nature is actually non-different from the Purushottama. It's the Kshara Purusha manifestation or aspect of the divine Purushottama. And so there's no duality there. So that doesn't actually hamper its infinitude or its non-duality. Does that make sense? That's how I see it, at least.
Is it like a different dimension?
Is what a different dimension?
The
Kshara Purusha?
The impersonal, the Akshara Purusha.
Mm. Different dimension from what?
From the different dimension of Purushottama?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So that is, this world of insentient entities and jivas is how the divine Purushottama manifests in this world and as this world. The non-dual self, the impersonal self, is transcendental. And it's kind of, you can think of it as the basis of this world, but it's still independent of this world. Right? So it's a different aspect. Independent in the sense that it's a kind of, you can think of it as a substratum. Right. But, and also, I mean, as sakshi in a sense. It's a witness.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. While also serving as a basis of all existence. That's where it's like kind of a different from the classical Advaita understanding of the non-dual self. Because according to classical Advaita, witness means it can have nothing to do with the world. And in fact, the world is an illusion. But Sri Aurobindo says, no, if you look carefully at the verses describing the impersonal self, you'll find that it is transcendental, it is non-dual. It has this quality of a witness. It's aloof in a certain sense, and yet it at the same time contains all existence, serves as a basis of all existence. So it's somewhat paradoxical. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Gita asks, with Thakur so clearly saying that the way to negate the troublesome ego is through a bhakti relationship, like a child or servant, why do you think Sri Aurobindo insisted on the jnana realization as the first spiritual necessity, because we need it to negate the ego? I think a large part of the answer has to do with, as I said earlier, that he's following the logic of the Gita itself. And chapter 2 emphasizes again and again the need to realize the impersonal self, and doesn't really emphasize bhakti much. So that's how I see it. At the same time, Sri Aurobindo, Sri Ramakrishna used to say, you can attain the realization of the self through the path of bhakti. Because by God's grace, you can also attain the realization of Brahman, non-dual Brahman. So Gita does not discourage practicing bhakti from the beginning. You can practice bhakti from the very beginning. There's absolutely no doubt. And remember, Karma Yoga itself has a kind of bhakti element in it. If you do works as an offering to the divine, as a worship of the divine. Okay? Proful asks a question. Is Sri Aurobindo suggesting that one start with a sattvic but ego-driven life of sacrifice, then move on to a state of witness consciousness? And he quotes from page 129. The way is to abandon attachment to the fruit of works, even while doing them. And the way is to recognize nature as the agent and leave her to do her works, and to live in the soul as the witness and sustainer, watching and sustaining her, but not attached either to her actions or the fruits. So notice here in this quote again, you have the witness, which is watching, but also sustaining. So there's always that kind of duality here. Okay, he quotes that. Then he says, that culminates in realization of the impersonal self, and then the Purushottama will reveal itself. And Praful asks, is it some kind of adhikari bheda? Which means the doctrine of differing spiritual competencies. It seems to suggest that worship of deities is the only method in the first stage and only in the first stage, followed by practicing witness consciousness in the second stage only. Okay, so yeah, I think this is similar to the Gita's question, actually. I think some people are getting... So I think it has to do with the structure of the Gita and the fact that bhakti is not emphasized from the beginning. But again, you can and should practice bhakti from the beginning. That becomes clear in the later chapters of the Gita. Chapter 9, for instance, where Krishna will say, whatever you do it as an offering to me. Yat karoshi, yadashnasi, yadjuhoshi dasiyat, yat tapasi kaunteya, tat gurushu madapanam. And you can, by doing that, by engaging in bhakti, you will realize the self. You will also attain the further realization of Vijnana by realizing the Purushottama. Okay? But it's just, we're not there yet. We're only in chapter 3, and that's why it's kind of, Sri Aurobindo is kind of following the logic of the Gita. Shubho asks an interesting question. Does Bhagavata Purana's 6.14.5 align with Bhagavad Gita 7.3, which we talked about in that handout that I gave you in the last class, the 2 classes ago? Or the concept of jnana and vijnana? The verse is, this is 6.14.5 of Bhagavata Purana. Muktanam api siddhanam narayana parayanaha sudurlabhaha prashantatma kotishu api mahamune. Okay, and I'll explain the translation of it in a second, but do you have the handout? 7.3?
Yeah.
Manushanam sahasreshu kaschyadhyati siddhe yatatam api siddhanam kaschin mam veti tattva. So 7.3 of the Gita says, among hundreds of thousands of people, only a few strive after liberation, perfection.
Yeah.
And then we get this tricky second line about yatatam api siddhanam kaschin mam veti tattva. Even among those perfected souls, only a tiny minority attain me, says Krishna, the Purushottama. Sri Aurobindo thinks this verse lends itself perfectly to this jnana, then followed by vijnana, right? So Shubha is asking, well, this reminds me of verse 6.14.5 of Bhagavata. The translation is, O great sage, among many millions who are liberated and perfect in knowledge of liberation, only a few, one may be a devotee of Lord Narayana or Krishna. Such devotees who are fully peaceful are extremely rare. I think there is a similarity, and I think the Bhagavata is influenced by the Bhagavad Gita, and so I don't think it's a coincidence. Yet, I think that there is a potential difference. I've written an entire academic article comparing Gaudiya Vaishnavism with Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, and I point out that one of the main differences is that if you study Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, it's full of hierarchies. Higher, lower, and they even rank order the different forms of God. So Krishna is the highest. Vishnu is a little lower, Divine Mother way lower, Shiva is sort of in between, and there's all these elaborate, even the heavens are hierarchically arranged. There's the highest heaven of Goloka, and then there's a bunch below it. But I don't think Sri Aurobindo interprets the Gita in this hierarchical way. Do you see what I mean? And I think he would agree with Sri Ramakrishna that whether you choose to eat sugar or whether you choose to become sugar, it's really a matter of preference, not about higher and lower. Okay, so it's not as hierarchical as this, arguably this Bhagavata view, which is that even among liberated souls, the greatest liberated souls are the worshippers of Krishna, right? Whereas just the ordinary liberated souls who have merged their individuality in non-dual Brahman, they're much inferior. Sri Ramakrishna would not use language of inferior and superior, and I don't think Sri Aurobindo would either. Okay? Okay, so do you have any questions about anything we talked about? No? Okay, good. All right, so we have covered study question 1, study question 2. Let me read one or two more online responses to study question number 2. So I'll remind you of what study question number 2 is. This is the Gita's teachings on the Purushotama, and then I ask, can you think of any teachings of Sri Ramakrishna that are similar or identical to what Sri Aurobindo is saying here? And Shubho says, yes, in the Gospel we find Sri Ramakrishna asserting that God exists simultaneously with forms and without form and encompasses infinitely more. He offered this response when Mohandas Gupta questioned the apparent contradictions inherent in such a concept. While logically and rationally incomprehensible, Sri Ramakrishna maintained that God is trans-rational and is the meeting ground of all apparent contradictions, or achintya, as Gaudiya Vaishnavas say. I think this is a really nice point because in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, there's this concept of achintyata, which means literally unthinkability. God is unthinkably great and unthinkably infinite, and so is the kind of meeting ground of all apparent contradictions. And Sri Ramakrishna would often say similar things. He'll say, look, I know that God is impersonal because I've realized Brahman. I know that God is also personal. Kali, Shiva, Ganesha, and so on and so forth. Christ, Allah. And you might ask, well, how is that? How can the same reality be both personal and impersonal? What will he say in response? Can a 1-seer pot contain 10 seers of milk? Can you pour 10 seers? No, it's not possible. Can this finite human intellect ever be able to grasp, comprehend the infinitude of God and understand how God can be both personal and impersonal. At best, what we can say is the infinite Purushottama is impersonal in one aspect and personal in another aspect. And that personal aspect, Shakti, can manifest in many different forms. And Sri Ramakrishna will use a beautiful analogy of an infinite ocean, which, due to the cooling influence of the breeze, the gentle breeze of Bhakti, forms into ice in different places. Each ice formation corresponds to a different form of the personal God. And then he says, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, these ice forms melt. And if the analogy stopped there, then it would support classical Advaita Vedanta, right? Shankara would be very happy. But Sri Ramakrishna then continues and says, in some places the ice doesn't melt at all. It becomes like quartz. Nitya Shakar. These are the eternal forms, Nitya Sakara, the eternal forms of the personal God. Right? So in the same way, I think Sri Aurobindo interprets the Gita, Krishna, as saying, you can eat sugar to your heart's content, and that can be the highest goal for you. You don't have to dissolve the personal God into Nirguna Brahman and become one with Nirguna Brahman, Brahmabhuta. That's one possibility, but you don't have to. And in fact, it's much more blissful to just nivasishyasi maiva, dwell in me, dwell with me. That's the idea. Okay. And I think we're good. Great. Okay. Thank you so much. See you guys on Sunday, the 15th of September. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.